So despite tariffs, Apple might actually be a good long-term buy.
On one side, we hear one thing, then we hear another thing, then we hear another thing. Apparently, the market seems to think that things are better for Apple right now.
Yeah, it was up 5% last time I looked. And let me try my best here to kind of lay out what happened on Friday night and through the weekend. So first of all, those Liberation Day tariffs, Apple's getting an exemption for those. That's because of phones, computers, et cetera, all fall into that category. But the tariffs are still on Apple because the so-called fentanyl tariffs, those are the 20% ones that went into effect earlier this year, those are still in effect. But other countries are now back to those pre-April 9th levels. That gives Apple all the options it had before to mitigate the effects of these tariffs. That includes things like diverting production to countries like India. We hear about that so often, and Vietnam. The 10% tariffs on those countries are gone. And this was the hope all along. Remember, going into the Trump administration, Cook had made that $1 million donation to the inauguration. He also showed up at the inauguration with all those other big tech CEOs. And everyone thought the tariff exceptions were mostly baked in before the last couple of weeks. Also gone, guys, no more chatter about building iPhones in the USA, at least because we heard what Secretary Lutnick has been saying on the Sunday shows yesterday. These exemptions could be temporary. They're going to start looking at some national security issues related to chips and all these devices. And then as Joe was just saying, Trump saying, no one's off the hook yet. The discussion now is gone around bringing these iPhone manufacturing to the United States because Bloomberg had a great report over the weekend about just the huge increase in India output for these iPhones. We've been seeing that since the COVID days when all the shutdowns affected their ability to manufacture in China because of factories getting shut down and so forth. They moved so much to India, and year over year, we just see these enormous increases of how many iPhones are being made in India. First of all, last week, they got the reprieve from the reciprocal tariffs. Now they have the reprieve from the overall, everything is gone. They have this overall exemption now. That is great news for them to really step on the gas in China, in Vietnam, and stay away from manufacturing so much in China. But again, at least 80 to 90% of iPhones are still made in China.
Welcome back. The flurry of tariff headlines, a key part of the Apple story today. Stock is a top gainer on the S&P, up 3.5% right now. Let's get to Steve Kovac, who is tracking all the action here. Steve.
Yeah, that's right, Leslie. And just lots of relief in the street reactions this morning after that exemption on those reciprocal tariffs came in. Goldman Sachs raising the price target, but some others cutting targets, including Citibank and JP Morgan. Still some concerns from analysts as well around the global macro environment that could hurt Apple's demand. KeyBank put it pretty well, though. They said, quote, this is the best case scenario that we can think of. Hard to argue with that one. Friday night exemptions gives Apple all of the options it had before these reciprocal tariffs went into effect to mitigate their impact. That means they can divert production to India and Vietnam, which no longer have those 10% tariffs. Time Bloomberg reporting over the weekend, Apple's now making 1 in 5 iPhones in India. Expect that number just to increase as they divert more over to India. And remember, this was the expectation all along that Apple would win these exemptions. We remember back before the Trump administration took power that Tim Cook, the CEO of Apple, donated $1 million to the inaugural fund and showed up to the inauguration with all those other tech CEOs. And by the way, there's also less pressure now on Apple to bring manufacturing to the U.S. thanks to these exemptions. And India is going to be the real focus for iPhone production.
Long-term opportunity. Joining us from Boca Capital Partners is Kim Forrest, and here with me on set is Dan Ives of Wedbush. Great to have you both with me. Good to see you. Dan, I'm going to start with you, which is, even if we get the best case scenario from here, if we get every single tariff removed and even some free trade deals that improve terms from where they were before, is Apple today worth less than it was 3 months ago because of the uncertainty that's arisen?
Yeah, I mean, you've already, I believe, even in a best case, numbers come down 5%, maybe even 7% in a best case because of the uncertainty, because of the supply chain. You know, they're not going to obviously give guidance along with the rest of tech. And look, I think the biggest thing here is supply chain. You can't just flip it on, flip it off. And I think the reality here is we took a step back from the cliff this weekend. That's our view in terms of its best case relative to a bad situation. But for Apple, hearts and lungs of their supply chain are in Asia. I mean, they can move some to India, but the reality for them is that they are sort of on a, you know, we'll call it, they're in a boat, middle of the ocean, flipped over, no life raft. And the reality is, to get back to shore, it's going to take time. White House gave them time, like Steve talked about, but they will ultimately, clock will strike midnight at some point. They're going to have to figure this out.
Kim, you hold Apple, I think I'm right in saying. I mean, how have you reacted over the last couple of weeks? Because it's an impossible thing to trade around.
Sure. Well, I don't think you want to trade like you would drive a car if you're crazy, with the 100% on the gas, then 100% on the brakes. But I do think having exposure to Apple is important. It really is the communication device for the developed world, pretty much. And so it's not likely to get knocked out of position, unless there's, the $1,000 phone becomes a $5,000 phone. And by the way, people pay for these over time. Few people are really shelling out $1,000. You're paying it over time through your carrier. So that's something to, comprehend there. But I think this is a wake-up call for all tech companies and all companies in general, not to get over committed to one geography. I thought we learned this in COVID, right? Like, don't have one supplier, but here we are.
So, Dan, on the flip side, I mean, what about demand for Apple and other products? It's not just the sort of supply chain and the cost impact, but are we going to see, either because we have a recession or because consumers' confidence falls, lack of demand, or even more complexly, are we going to see something like the Tesla Musk effect on companies like Apple if countries around the world want to buy, buy British, I say, well, we're still going to have to buy Apple or Samsung phones because we don't make any. But there might be a global effect on demand, particularly in China.
And we've talked about, in China, the biggest worry here is that you get more and more domestic, Huawei over Apple, a BYD over Tesla. And that's when you deal with these third rail issues, these are some of the ripple effects that could happen. But when it comes to demand, look, we've already set in motion a snowball that's going downhill, and that's the economy. And it's hard. You can't just stop that. I think our whole focus over the last week, and I think the weekend, White House took some step back from the cliff, however you want to call it, in terms of the exemptions, gives them time. But you're still playing with fire here because of the demand issue. But ultimately, when it comes to supply chain, the reality is, that's not going to change for years. I mean, it would take Apple, in our opinion, to cost $30 billion. 10% of the supply chain. That would take 3 years.
So basically, what are these experts all trying to tell us? They're basically saying that Apple may not get hit as hard as we think. Now, there's a lot that could still happen in the next 90 days because of tariffs, but there are a lot of things that these experts have said to consider. So just to basically summarize what you've heard here, Apple made a pretty sizable Trump campaign donation. Exemptions have led to about a 20% tariff versus 145. Thanks to the latest exemptions announced by Trump, iPhones are being made more and more in India, and they've actually been doing this since COVID. A lot of people are saying, they're just now starting to make some in India, which is apparently around 1 in 5 at this point, but could increase by as much as 60%, according to some experts. It's still around 80% or so are still made in China, but again, that could shift more towards countries like India and Vietnam, which no longer have a 10% tariff. But, that remains to be seen how all of that is going to play out as the rest of the year goes on and deals are made. Apple also doesn't have to mass produce in the US because of this, because of exemptions and because of being able to use India and Vietnam. So there's not a huge pressure for them to build these big plants in the US, which probably would have driven up the price to astronomical rates. Trump says no one is off the hook for tariffs. We already know that. Apple still has the communication device of the developed world, as was mentioned by one of the experts. So it's still kind of the gold standard for smartphones, despite what, some people may disagree with that. But basically what experts are saying, don't put everything into Apple, but don't just completely sell all of Apple either. Obviously, this is not me giving you financial advice. I'm just summarizing what a lot of these experts are telling us right now. But it could be good to have exposure to Apple long term, and they may not, again, get hit as hard as we thought. But there still could be supply chain issues for years. Best case scenario, we had an expert mention that it could be a drop in sales of somewhere between maybe 5 and 10%, could be worse. But although a lot remains to be seen how all of the tariff deals will play out, it seems like Apple might actually be okay. And they were actually up 2.21% today, and over the last 5 days, up 8.55%.